Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I am here as always with my friend, colleague, and co-host, soon to depart the United States for greener pastures up north, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. How are you, Tim?
Hello, Brian.
I hope I didn't.
Yes,
I hope I didn't jinx it. By the way,
I
I don't
hope you
think. I
didn't
don't think.
jinx it, but I doubt that you did, and it can't come too soon. I actually was planning to record this from the office for the first time in a while, and tried to drive into the office, but the protests over the Cuban crackdown actually had shut that entire area down. So
Yeah.
peaceful protests in the United States. We'll talk some more about the protests in Cuba on the same
Yeah.
issue later on in the
Exactly.
episode.
Exactly. Timely as always. And the next time around, hopefully Tim will be commenting on that from parts up north, if all
I'm
goes according to
guessing
plan.
there will not be a lot of protests that will keep me from getting to my destination in
No,
Canada. That would
no,
be
I'm
my
guessing
guess.
that
But
is the
see,
that is the truth. They'll block your way to hot yoga, perhaps, but not anything else.
hopefully
Hopefully
not.
not.
Hopefully
Hopefully
not.
not. Hopefully not. Anyway, thank you to everyone for joining us again on the latest episode of Embargoed. Thank you to our guests the last time around, Mr. Richard Mojica, Mr. Nate Langford. Really appreciate their time. Appreciate all the positive feedback we got from everybody that suggests that you like Ricky and Nate better than you like me and Tim. Our feelings aren't hurt. They are lovely, intelligent gentlemen. So we're always happy to have them back on. But no, seriously, thank you to everybody who responded to the last episode, which I think was really good. And in some ways kind of sets up a couple of things we're going to talk about today on this episode, which I think we have resolved is going to, we always say this, but we think is going to be a relatively compact, brisk episode. We have four topics, only one lightning round topic today, and then we are probably only going to give you one episode in August, given vacation schedules, travel schedules, etc. So this will be the last regular one in a while, in all likelihood. But so before we get to that, of course, the normal. I'll just dispense with the normal preliminary matters. We're not giving legal advice. We're not sharing any confidential information. Any views and opinions that you dislike, abhor, or generally don't agree with are mine and Tim's alone, nobody else's, so blame us. If you do enjoy the pod, please subscribe. Please give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. Please spread the word. You can find us anywhere you get your pod content. And with that, let me just run down quickly what we're going to cover today. So we have, as I said, four topics. Number one is actually not Cuba, it is Hong Kong, and specifically the Hong Kong Business Advisory that came out just a few days after we recorded the last episode. So we're going to cover that. Then we're going to get to Cuba. We're going to talk about what's happening literally on the streets of Cuba and in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. government's response to that and what we expect going forward. Then we're going to pivot to two of our favorite topics, Nord Stream 2 and JCPOA 2.0. And that'll be our program for today. And then in the lightning round, we're going to do a little bit of somewhat of an amorphous topic. But given what we talked about the last time around with Richard and Nate about CBP enforcement, and given that we're now 6 months in to the Biden administration, and there were actually a handful of enforcement actions that came out of OFAC and DOJ last week, or significant developments in some enforcement actions out of OFAC and DOJ, we thought we would kind of check in on enforcement generally, trends, sort of anecdotally that perhaps we've been noticing, just some early thoughts to share with everybody on that. And then that'll be our program for today. So before we get started, Tim, any final words, any initial thoughts? Kick us
No,
off.
I think you've summed it up nicely, Brian.
Okay. So with that, let's get right into it. So topic number one, as I said, the Hong Kong Business Advisory, which was issued, it was a joint advisory that was obviously, we spent a lot of time on the last episode talking about the Xinjiang advisory. This one came out a few days later. It was a joint advisory issued by State, Treasury, Commerce, and Homeland Security on July 16th. And there are a few kind of interesting things about the advisory that we want to highlight. I'll highlight quickly, and then I'll sort of throw to Tim for his thoughts. So, the title of this is Risks and Considerations for Businesses Operating in Hong Kong, and I think it is clearly no accident that this came out 1 year uh, since uh, the passage and the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong. And in fact, there was a statement that was put out by Secretary Blinken on the same day that this was released, noting and commemorating the 1 year the sort of 1 year anniversary of the national security law. So this is in some ways kind of a well-timed kind of marketing slash some more cynical might call it propaganda effort by the U.S. to sort of use that, I think, and refocus some attention perhaps on what's happening in Hong Kong, and also raise perhaps general awareness on a few different issues that are all kind of coming together in connection with doing business in Hong Kong at the moment for foreign companies. I should say that notably the trade compliance aspects of this, there literally were sort of four things that are listed in this advisory, and it deals more. It sort of trade compliance is kind of at the bottom of the list in some ways. There were sort of four things that are mentioned, and they're talking about the risk of arrest for the national security law, data under data privacy considerations, which, as we know, are a big concern in China and now, by extension, in Hong Kong. Transparency and access to information, and then it's sort of worrying about sort of U.S. authorities in relating to sanctions and other trade-related restrictions, including the change that BIS affected late last year to treat Hong Kong as to take away its separate destination under the EAR and essentially treat it just like China is treated. So I would note also that the final 2 pages of the advisory basically just document all of the laws that China has put in place to potentially deter those in Hong Kong from complying with U.S. Sanctions and export control laws, including of course, the anti-sanctions law that just got passed recently, and a few other of the Chinese laws that are now in the books that are clearly, I think, making everyone who does business in the country very concerned about what the long-term prospects are there. But at the end of the day, and this sort of builds on what we've talked about before. In terms of the actual sanctions and export control risk at the moment for Hong Kong, it's not that much has changed. There have been a series and a smattering of designations that have happened over the last year. There are a number of authorities that are out there that could be the basis for additional designations that we've talked about, quite extensively over the last year. There are more entity listings. There is the change to the EAR that we mentioned in terms of separate country status. But as we talked about not that long ago, maybe the last month or two, the most recent report that the State Department sent to Congress noted that there were no foreign financial institutions that have been found to be engaged in significant transactions with those that are subject to, that are engaging in sort of these anti-democratic human rights abuses in Hong Kong. And unless or until that domino falls and the financial world, has a cautionary tale or note to look to here, it's hard to see how, from that perspective, things are going to change. Now, I think there's, I'm sure the U.S. government said there's value in, again, packaging all this up, sending it out as a bit of a marketing effort. 1 year anniversary. Let's remind everybody things are troublesome in Hong Kong right now and could be getting worse. And if you stay committed there long term, whether it's to operate there, to do business there, to have headcount there, whatever the case may be, as a foreign company, you could find yourself in a very difficult situation. You could wake up one day, 6 months from now, a year from now, or more, and have either regulatory or legal problems on your hand. You could find that subject to a data breach. You could have other problems. You could find yourself in trouble with OFAC or BIS. So at the end of the day, I don't want to say there's not a lot of there, but this is in some ways just kind of a repackaging, as these advisories always tend to be. This is kind of an opportunistic repackaging of lots of different considerations in one place with a bow on top to sort of remind everybody who perhaps has not spent a lot of time thinking about this that they should be worrying about this. And people who are worrying about this, as we know from having discussions with folks who do have these things front of mind, they're worrying about it a lot and they're already doing something about this. And this is probably not going to change that at all. But as sort of a friendly reminder to everybody, that this is, I think the primary value that I would see behind this. And with that, I will toss it to Tim to see what his thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are along the same lines. I mean, this is an acknowledgement. It's an acknowledgement that, in 1997, when the British handed Hong Kong back to the Chinese, the catchphrase was two systems, one country. That there was going to be a Hong Kong where you had a relatively independent judiciary. It was somewhat Western facing, but you still had all of the benefits of really being in the China business community. And Hong Kong prospered for many years because of that, because I think companies took comfort in the idea that some of the data privacy risks and some of the other risks of doing business in China and some of the potential human rights concerns in doing business in China weren't there in Hong Kong. And I think what this advisory does is really acknowledge what was really starting to come into play a year ago, which was the idea that it's now one system, one country. Hong Kong is no different than Beijing or Shanghai from a business perspective. And in fact, in many ways, it's more dangerous now from a business perspective because you have a sanctions risk that in some ways you don't have in Shanghai or Beijing. And so I think it acknowledges that Hong Kong is no longer kind of a separate business area that you can kind of take comfort in the fact that it's a little bit different from China, although it's in many ways part of China. But I will say that it does, hasten what I see as the trend already of businesses to turn away from Hong Kong to other places where they think they might be able to get the same sorts of benefits of doing business in the Far East, but kind of outside of China's at least direct umbrella. And so I think this will, is just another signal that the U.S. is encouraging kind of not divestment from China, but encouraging U.S. companies for sure and Western companies to think about other areas besides Hong Kong now, because the Hong Kong that existed 10 years ago really doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, and in that way, I think that's a good point. And in that way, it's of a piece with the decoupling conversation that we had last time with Richard and Nate. And it is really all part of the same calculus for the U.S. is that, underscoring this point, emphasizing this point to the global business community is all part of, again, the U.S. effort to obviously get companies based in the U.S. to decouple from China, now Hong Kong, but even more broadly, if there's any way to use that sort of softer persuasion on non-U.S. companies, perhaps, or companies that don't have the deep ties to the U.S., to flag all of the risks of continuing on there without any change in behavior, change in strategy, change in the risk calculus is, really what seems to be going on here. That's the big takeaway from this. And again, in some ways, this is all old news because we've talked about this, extensively. But it's always interesting when the U.S. government sees the need or the benefit of putting together a paper like this, an advisory like this, to get it out, because it does in some ways try essentially elevate the message to some degree, and I think that's what they're going for here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost a nice segue into the next segment, unless you have more on Hong Kong, Brian.
No, let's turn to Cuba.
It's just a we talked about this a couple podcasts ago, that the Biden administration has made a point of really trying to prioritize human rights as part of its foreign policy agenda. And at the end of the day, the Hong Kong sanctions are about human rights, or at least what the U.S. perceives as intrusions on human rights in Hong Kong. So intrusions on the independent judiciary, intrusions on the right of peaceful protest. Last Thursday, the U.S. government, the Treasury Department, imposed sanctions. They put Cuba's defense minister and a special forces unit of the Interior Ministry in Cuba on the global Magnitsky, on the SDN list under the global Magnitsky program, which is at bottom a human rights program that allows OFAC to sanction various government actors or foreign individuals for what the U.S. perceives as human rights violations. And I think before we talk about kind of what that means from a just a pure kind of technical sanctions perspective, I think it's important to put it into context. The protests, as I mentioned at the outset, some support. I believe, at least from what I could tell from my car as I was sitting in traffic, I believe that the protesters today were supporting the protest that has been going on in Cuba for most of the last 6 months. As most listeners to the podcast know, that there have been a series of peaceful protests in Cuba. They apparently arose starting in November of 2020 when the Cuban government cracked down on the San Isidro movement, which is a civil society group that is basically opposed to restrictions on artistic impression. So this movement apparently started with a crackdown on the artists, like a lot of movements start. I mean, the poets and the artists are often what governments fear most because they can inspire people to see things that they might not otherwise have seen. And after the crackdown, apparently a well-known group of Cuban hip-hop artists released a song called Patria y Vida, Country and Life, critical of the government, and that became an instant hit and basically rallied the people to start kind of rising up against the Cuban government for to protest massive repressions of human rights and slow progress on COVID in terms of vaccinations, food shortages, blackouts. I mean, the situation is pretty dire in Cuba, as I understand it, and so this was the backdrop behind which the government, as many authoritarian governments around the world, use crackdowns on peaceful protests, like in Hong Kong, like in Havana. For a little while, that sort of thing happened here when we had the government march out into a peaceful protest and do a photo opportunity in the middle of a church. But usually in the United States, that doesn't happen. So that was the backdrop behind the sanctions of the defense minister and the Interior Legion in Cuba. I think what is important about it, because I was reading the questioning with the State Department about this, and the questioning was somewhat along the lines of, well, why does this even matter? I mean, Cuba is under embargo. The entire government is basically on a do not deal list, and so why does this matter? And I think the response was kind of telling. I mean, I think it matters for two reasons. The first is because it's under the global Magnitsky programs, it's a little different type of sanction. And I think it's one where the thinking of the government is that the world community will view this as different. And the reason it will view, because the world community really has not warmed to the Cuba sanctions program in the 60 years it's been around. It's one of the most unilateral programs. Really, the rest of the world not only does not honor the Cuba embargo, but many of our allies have laws that prohibit their own citizens from complying with the Cuba embargo. But I think using the global Magnitsky and emphasizing human rights violations is designed to both kind of, in the eyes of the world, make these sanctions a little bit different. And as a legal matter, they are a little bit different. They come under a different executive order. They actually have provisions that are in some sense secondary sanctions, because materially assisting anybody who is the subject of these sanctions is itself sanctionable. And although the State Department response to why they did this was somewhat terse, that seemed to be what they're getting at. They said, well, we're not going to talk about where these various people have assets because that would tip them off. But I think that my guess is that they realize that the sanctioned parties have assets outside of Cuba that potentially could be reached if they're in allied countries, or at least they will create the threat for those allied countries that there could be some sort of material support or financial support sanction if you were to continue to deal with these individuals and with these groups. And because it's global Magnitsky, it's not subject to these same blocking laws that the other sanctions are, or at least arguably not subject to them. And so it's one that the rest of the world community could honor without generally honoring the Cuba embargo. So I think that that might be the beginning of something in Cuba with sanctions policy that the U.S. may be taking on to try and kind of carve this out of the general Cuba embargo, which the world really doesn't honor, and say, well, this is different. This is support for the protesters. This is a human rights issue. It's not just kind of a U.S., we want a different government in Cuba type issue. We're just supporting the protesters, and you need to support these sanctions, or else, you'll be acting against the protesters. So I thought it was interesting. They also said it's the beginning. I mean, there's a number of measures in place that the administration is considering that is really going to be part of support for the protesters, and this is just one. But when I first thought it, I thought kind of this is just purely symbolic. But as I've thought about it more, I actually think there is a much bigger purpose to it.
Yeah, I think it's also that brings up another good point, which is we've talked a lot about what the Biden administration wants to do with Cuba and whether they would revert back to kind of Obama era Cuba policy or keep a hard line, and sort of what the path was with Cuba. And it was a little unclear. We talked a lot about the political risks of just sort of lightening restrictions on Cuba with the regime there still firmly in power, and with the blowback that we know that could create here in the U.S., especially in a place like Florida. And I think now with something like this, and there were no real signals for once Biden took office that was going to happen. We were speculating a little bit that was perhaps going to happen, but most of the rhetoric and most of the behavior has suggested that he was going to maintain a fairly hardline. I think now there's really no choice. I think as long as the regime is going to do things like this, that there is no choice. And I think Tim's right that using GLOMAG as the sort of the hammer to go after the folks that are behind this most directly is actually kind of a nice tactical advantage for the U.S. because it does bring in and as Tim said, I think have the benefit of being able to stand on a pure kind of human rights basis for cracking down on these individuals and entities, which is something that's very hard to turn your nose up at, even for countries that have not been supportive of the Cuban embargo. And so I do think there's a lot of appeal to that. And perhaps if there was ever going to be some kind of multilateral support for kind of forcing further action in Cuba to perhaps finally get regime change, free elections, a real turning of the page there, perhaps something like this could be it. Now, we've seen some version of this in many different countries around the world, in the last several years, and it hasn't exactly kind of coalesced to that yet, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I mean, Cuba is a bit of a special case, just given the history there and given the sort of nature of the countries that are sort of backing Cuba, and those that are perhaps now falling back, maybe in closer alignment with the U.S. on how they're doing on how they're conducting foreign policy in light of the new administration. So I think to me that's kind of the biggest thing that'll be interesting to see is sort of what is this signal for the next chapter here. I would say as a smaller kind of more technical matter, there was a lot of chatter. I think this came straight from the White House, and I saw it in a few other places as well. There has been an ongoing debate about what to do in terms of allowing or perhaps loosening restrictions on sending remittances to Cuba from the U.S. And there's been a fear, and there has been a history of the regime essentially intercepting those or taking a cut of those and enriching themselves. But I think there is certainly now some momentum or a lot of discussion about perhaps a smarter way or a better way to allow that to be able to essentially help finance the resistance almost in some ways, or not even the resistance, but even just as Tim said, the situation there, conditions there, by all accounts, are quite dire at the moment, especially with COVID raging. And so, for humanitarian reasons and also for perhaps other pro-democracy reasons, there would be good reason to find a way to do this. And I think that would be the next thing I would keep an eye on is what is the U.S. and what is OFAC going to do and the state going to do about the remittance issue, which I think is a big problem and is not an easy one to solve necessarily, but is one that I think a lot of folks are trying to wrestle with right now. So that's sort of the last thing I would say on that.
Yeah, on the sanctions issue, I think remittance reform, I think might be what they would call it, is coming.
I like that. I like
there's
that.
there is a commission that the president put together that just got started last week that is going to look at remittances and try and figure out a way to make sure that the remittances really get to the Cuban people and don't get to the Cuban government, if that's possible, and try and change U.S. remittance law, because there is an exception to the embargo that allows for remittances under certain circumstances, to try and change those rules to make them better able to get the money into the hands of the people that the U.S. wants to go into. I think two other things to look at. One is they're looking at reforming the embargo, or changing the embargo to allow more wider access and to a better internet in Cuba, if that's possible. So I think that's the other thing from a sanctions perspective to look for, is whether or not there's going to be changes to some of the general licenses that involve telecommunications, which may also be coming. The final thing to look for, which really isn't sanctions related, is more kind of implementing human rights policy related, is that they're going to try and rebuild back the U.S. embassy in Cuba so that it can actually serve as a place where the administration can keep its finger on the pulse of what's happening on the ground, but also provide some limited support for human rights on the ground in Cuba.
Right. Staff it up, and
Yep.
there had been a skeleton crew down there for the last few years, but that's, by all accounts, that's what's going to happen. So anyway, this is a fascinating one. We will be keeping, and obviously quite consequential, given the long history with the U.S. and Cuba, and so we will keep a close watch on this, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to it before too long. Let us pivot now to topics 3 and 4, which I think will both be brief. These, although they are two of our favorites. So. Given that we have already done, for topic 3, given that we have already done a podcast recently titled "Waving the White Flag" with respect to Nord Stream 2, I think we're on record as having expected something like this to happen.
We definitely called that.
Yeah, so it is official now that the U.S. has announced last week. In the mix, there's a package of announcements, but relating to climate change and a number of other initiatives that the U.S. and Germany are going to be working on together, or committed to work on together, in terms of, in particular, supporting Ukraine, which is obviously a centerpiece of the Nord Stream 2 kerfuffle. But the U.S. has essentially admitted the pipeline is going to be finished, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we are going to. We're not happy about that. We are still, very concerned about the mischief that Russia may get up to here in terms of weaponizing its, control over the energy supply. But we have listened to our friends from Germany, and we are going to essentially stand down with respect to Nord Stream 2. Now, fascinating for anybody who hasn't seen this, there was a briefing that was done. And the State Department, as anonymous State Department official who was doing an on-the-record briefing for a number of media folks, basically went through, and the talking points were essentially, again, this is something we have discussed almost exactly to the point, but they basically pointed out, despite multiple statutory authorizations that were in place for the prior administration, they chose to do nothing. They literally did nothing with respect to Nord Stream 2.
Right.
Until the final day of the administration, when they sanctioned one vessel and one entity, and that was it. Right. And since we've come into office, we actually sanctioned 19 entities and vessels, and we have done our part to try to hold accountable the people that are responsible for building the pipeline. However, we can't ignore reality, which is this pipeline is going to get finished. And given that, and given our close ties and our important relationship with Germany, we're essentially going to admit defeat, and we're going to work with Germany to secure, hopefully, the future energy supply and sovereignty of Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, and also we have talked to Poland and other sort of regional allies that are hugely affected by this to ensure that they are on board with all of this, and this is how we're going to proceed. Now, I would just say very quickly as a last comment, the sanctions are not going away. They haven't been lifted. I mean, we talked about this a few episodes ago with the sanctions that did come into place. Obviously, with the general licenses that are in place there's a lot you can still do. There's very little that was really truly restricted, unless for U.S. persons were trying to deal directly relating to the pipeline project. But otherwise, these parties were, business was still it was still possible to do a lot of business with Marine Rescue Service and some of the other entities that were hit by the PISA sanctions. But it is at the end of the day, this is sort of I think the official now death rattle for Nord Stream 2 as an enforcement priority for the U.S. government, despite again the multiple authorities that are on the books that, as the State Department rightly pointed out, the Trump administration chose not to actually exercise when they had the ability to do so. So I'll toss it to Tim for some final thoughts, since this is one of his favorite topics.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there was there was obviously a lot of political cover at play during that State Department briefing. We're not backing down. We're just playing the hand that we were dealt, and we just made the call that that as a practical matter, we can't stop this pipeline. So basically, what we ought to do is get the best deal we can from Germany, because we can either, continue to be really crosswise with the Germans on this, and still not stop the pipeline, or we can cut a deal with the Germans to. I mean, there's actually a lot of green energy funds that the Germans committed to out of this deal to go back and try and kind of wean Ukraine and some of these other countries off the dependence on fossil fuels that currently is a big part of their economy. And so that was essentially the carrot that they tried to get out of this. Now, interestingly, the State Department suggested, I think they said in the briefing, there was no deal. And they had to be really careful, because the problem that they have is they do have a mandatory sanctions regime imposed by Congress. So they can't really say that they've agreed not to enforce the sanctions. They're granting waivers.
I think that was asked. Yeah, that was asked explicitly by a reporter or two. Like, so you're telling me the sanctions are going away? And they're like, no, we're not saying that.
No, and in fact, we're not saying that we're lifting them. We can't. But what we're saying is we're granting the waiver because we view it as in the best interests of foreign policy, namely that this and national security, namely this pipeline is going to be built, and like whether we sanction them or not, because the Trump administration didn't do anything. I mean, that's their view, and I think objectively, two impositions of sanctions against a pipeline where it's pretty easy to tell who's doing the work on the pipeline, it's a pretty fair case that if the Trump administration wanted to stop this, they should have been doing a little bit more than two sanctions in the last couple of weeks of the administration. But it's basically I thought it was interesting how cautious they were about what they're doing with the sanctions, because there is this, there are a couple of mandatory provisions under both CATSA and PISA where they really are not able to just walk away and say, do whatever you want with respect to Nord Stream, and you won't get sanctioned, because if they were to do that, I mean, I'm not sure what Congress's remedy would be in those circumstances.
Well, Ted Cruz is going to throw a fit no matter what, as has been. He's going to put a hold on every. He's going to put a hold on every nominee from now until 2030. But
But I also think, other than that, I mean, it's this is not particularly. I don't think a court is going to order the administration to change foreign policy on this. So I'm not sure how enforceable those
Right.
provisions are against the
Well,
administration, but I think
and
they're
as
just
we
trying to be
know,
careful.
right, and as we know, even the mandatory provisions, there's a ton of discretion there, and so
Right.
I think the signal is clear as to which way that discretion is going to be exercised in all likelihood going forward. But you're 100% correct. I think the one other takeaway I would add to this, which we've talked about before, sort of two related points, which is sanctions are not the answer to everything. And because, as you said, we're playing the hand we're dealt. If we came in and tried a maximum pressure approach or something like that, it would just be banging our heads against the wall for to what end? And then two, the uh, the value that this administration certainly places on restoring good ties with close allies like Germany, and the idea that we're gonna sort of we're gonna stand with our friends in Germany here, and we're not going to completely undercut them or continue to antagonize them. We're gonna come to some accommodation that's in our interest, that's in their interest, and it's in the interest of Ukraine and Poland and these other countries that are affected by this as well. I think to me that's the message.
Right. I mean, it's not. I think the fundamental disagreement between the Trump and the Biden administrations on sanctions is that Trump viewed sanctions. I'm speaking of the administration, not necessarily the former president, but that administration viewed sanctions as a way to send a message about what we like and what we don't like, and they really gave or appeared to give no thought as to whether or not, as a practical matter, that those sanctions would make things better or worse, or there was any strategic purpose going on. It was basically a if we don't like you as a matter of foreign policy, whether you be the International Criminal Court or whether you be, the crackdown in Hong Kong or the crackdown in Xinjiang or what have you, sanctions was their tool. And some of those policies actually stand, in my view, a chance of working, and others were insane. But that was not their purpose. They really didn't seem to give any thought whatsoever to the strategically as to the reason for sanctions. And by contrast, I mean, the Biden administration doesn't seem to be inclined to impose sanctions for the purpose of making a statement. And again, I was actually, that was my initial impression of what they did in Cuba. And then when I looked more closely at it, it's not what's going on. I think there is a strategic purpose there, and I think that there certainly is a strategic purpose here. And it comes down to whether you believe that these sanctions really, if you view sanctions as a strategic matter, I think reasonable people could disagree about whether or not, if the U.S. amped up sanctions even at this late date, maybe they could do something to throw the pipeline off. And maybe that's Ted Cruz's point, or maybe he has a different one. But I think to the extent you want to make the point that it's not too late, maybe you can make that case. It looks to me like it's too late. I tend to agree with the administration, but the bigger point here is that they're basically saying we don't think sanctions are going to work, and so all they're going to do is make our allies mad. And instead of doing that, imposing sanctions for no purpose, we're actually going to get some benefit for the parties that we're actually trying to protect with these sanctions through the carrot from Germany, and we're gonna basically walk away at that point. And that makes sense to me, right. But it is not. It is completely different with what the Trump administration did, in the sense that we are essentially standing down on sanctions against a government, the Russian government, with which we have fundamental disagreements and don't want to send a signal of approval.
Right. So anyway, an interesting illustration, I think, of the differing approaches there, and we'll see what else may bubble up in the Nord Stream 2 realm, but it could very well be that we're not going to be circling back to this one too often in the future, given that we have talked about it quite a lot over the last year plus. So with that, let's move to a topic we will most certainly be coming back to after this week, which is JCPOA 2.0. So Tim, tell the world, tell our viewers what's happening with round 7, and what is your prediction for what's going to happen next?
So round 7 is not happening at this point. There is somewhat of a standoff with respect to round 7. The U.S. government says that there are things happening, even though the participants to the talks are not back in Vienna, that they're still being able to accomplish various things, that Rob O'Malley is still working from Washington to try and uphold the U.S. side. They did say something that we've actually said on the podcast, I think almost directly in the State Department briefing that I saw, which was that the clock is ticking and this deal gets less valuable with every tick of the clock for the U.S. And at some point, it will become, the balance will change the other way. So time is not on their side. I also read some reports that the U.S. has been signaling that if the deal falls apart, that they may start to look at all of these Chinese oil purchases from Iran from a secondary sanctions perspective, because, it's now not even a secret. I was going to say it's an open secret, but it's just, publicly known now that China is buying a lot of oil from Iran, even though the secondary sanctions are still in place. And so significant transactions within the petroleum sector in Iran are sanctionable, and Chinese entities are engaging in significant transactions with the petroleum sector in Iran openly on the pages of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And so the U.S. has signaled that it's going to actually start paying attention to that again if the deal falls apart. Although as an enforcement matter, when you're trying to essentially negotiate to lift those sanctions, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to start cracking down on those sanctions. So they haven't done it yet, but they've started to threaten to do it. On the Iranian side, what I've seen is also something that we predicted on this, but it's the first time I've seen it publicly, and that is that Iran. One big sticking point is that Iran wants an enforceable mechanism so that the U.S. can't just back out again in 2024 if a different president gets elected. And the U.S. position is, that you can't tie the hands of the next administration like that. I think the Iran proposal that I saw was that the UN, you'd essentially have to back out through the UN, and the US, I think rightly says that would give Russia a veto over a back out. But I don't know why you couldn't have a commission of, France, Germany, and England decide whether or not anybody could back out. The U.S. really shouldn't be able to object to that and say that they would be unreasonable in those circumstances. And so I haven't seen that proposed, but if the only objection from the U.S. side is that Russia would have a veto, you just propose a commission that Russia's not part of, and those parties actually happen to be in the room. So they certainly, and by that I mean the UK, France, and Germany are in the room, so they could do that. And I don't think Iran's demand is altogether unreasonable there. They had a deal and they didn't do anything wrong by all accounts, and the U.S. backed out of the deal for no reason. And hard to go back to a deal in which the other side can just walk away whenever they want.
Yeah, I just can't see the U.S. ever agreeing to that, ever agreeing to any guarantee of no withdrawal. I don't see how that's
without cause.
If it is a guarantee, it's going to be a guarantee that they could easily break, essentially. And I think it's been, the point's been raised, like that's something like that where the UN would have a voice on this, or a role on this, or anybody else would have a role on this, to determine a hugely consequential piece of U.S. foreign policy would probably be unconstitutional, or potentially be unconstitutional.
It certainly would be unenforceable, but the optics would at least be good, right? At least there, what President Trump did. There was nothing in the deal that violated, because the deal just never imagined that.
Never contemplated it, right? Of course. So, right, that's a whole. To some degree, I just don't even know how much of that is. By some accounts, it sounds like that's the primary sticking point, is this idea of a no withdrawal guarantee by the U.S. But at the same time, as Tim said, Iran is now, enriching at a rate that is really causing alarm. Inspectors are not able to get in. The window is closing. The Raisi team is coming on board very soon, once he's officially in office in just the next couple weeks. And it seems like nothing's going to really happen until that occurs, in all likelihood. It looks like we're kind of in a lame duck period, and may not happen. But I think at the end of the day, the point Tim raised before about, at the end of it all comes back to China. And I think the idea that if the U.S. were willing to just unload on China, I have a suspicion that there are many, many, many sanctions targets that could be designated tomorrow, in terms of shipping networks and other companies that are involved in what are reported to be 1 million barrels a day of petroleum
It's
that are being
huge.
purchased by the
It's a
Chinese.
huge
It's a
amount of
huge
petroleum.
number. And the U.S., I mean, this is always the calculus, is that China just doesn't care. China doesn't care, and they are willing to thumb their noses at the U.S. and say, we're going to do what we want to do because we know we have the backing of our government to completely disregard U.S. sanctions and go ahead and try to tag us if you want to, but we don't think you're going to have the stomach to do it. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. And I saw in some reports that the administration may be considering whether to do that to force Iran to the table, to try to force a deal as opposed to wait and see if a deal breaks down. So the sequencing and the timing, query whether that might be the straw that, sort of breaks this thing apart if that were to happen, because they would be so up in arms that would just everybody would retreat to their respective countries and nobody would be willing to talk again. But we'll have to see. I think in the course of the next month, probably by the time we record the next one of these, or certainly by the time we get to early September and we do a check-in on what's happening here, I would think we're going to have a little more clarity. We've been thinking for a while now we were close, but I think that the China issue is a big one. And I mean,
Yeah.
we see some version of this in many different contexts. I mean, we've seen this with Venezuela. We've seen this with, they're willing to, large Chinese entities are willing to just completely disregard U.S. sanctions and the secondary sanctions risk, in part because they know that they have the backing of their government, which they view to be co-equal with the U.S. and they just don't care, and they're not as reliant on the U.S. financial system, and they're willing to run the risk to make huge profit. So that's where this thing stands, and that could make or break this. I don't know, but we'll see. We'll see.
Well, and we've talked a lot about predictions that have come true here. I'm sure that if you go back in the public record, you could find a lot of predictions, at least that I've made, that haven't come true. But I mean, on this one, I said on the record a bunch of times right at the time that the U.S. pulled out that President Trump was essentially handing over the Iran trade to China, potentially for a generation and potentially for longer. I mean, part of the beauty of the JCPOA was that it allowed Iran to be Western facing, which is by all accounts what Iran historically has wanted to do in terms of trade, but that China has always been there as an alternative. And when we pulled out of the JCPOA, it meant that Europe, which is really concerned about U.S. sanctions, really was going to change its behavior quite a bit. There were big questions about whether the Chinese would. Now, to my surprise, maybe to your surprise too, I mean, we weren't podcasting at this point, Brian, but the Chinese seemed to go along with the secondary sanctions at the beginning. For a very short amount of time, they stopped buying Iranian oil, but it didn't last very long, and now they've become the biggest customer of Iran in the world. And if the U.S. were to try what has been reported, where they essentially try to force Iran back to the table by sanctioning China. I mean, China is a party to these negotiations too. So how that would affect the negotiations, where the U.S. is essentially imposing sanctions on one of the parties that is essentially at this table, in order to force the other party into a deal. I think it's be careful what you wish for if you try to go down that road, because I just think all hell would break loose, and I can't imagine that would give them a better chance of getting Iran to agree to the deal.
Well, I think that's the main reason why it hasn't happened yet, is the administration understands that, to your point, all hell would break loose, and that the secondary and tertiary consequences of that would probably be not to the U.S.'s benefit in the net, right? So trying to figure out a way to thread this needle where at least the threat of that may be something you want everybody to know about, but you don't necessarily want to do it, and how to get everybody to a reasonable place where it doesn't look like the U.S. is getting their lunch money stolen from them by getting back into this deal because they're giving up everything or too much to do a U-turn on the policy decision that President Trump made in 2018. This is proving to be very complicated, as we thought it would be at the outset. Even though there was a lot of good feeling and sentiment early on, it's definitely going to be a deal. There's definitely going to be a deal. Yeah, lo and behold, here we are several months into this and no deal. And now it looks like we're farther away than we've ever been, perhaps.
Yeah.
So we'll just have to see.
Well, I mean, the one thing. So first of all, to talk about a prediction or at least an observation that I made a couple of weeks ago that has turned out to be wrong. I mean, I was of the belief that that Rice would not want to negotiate his own deal here, that he would want to let the Rouhani government do this so that he would not be stuck with it if the deal turned out, if they got back into a deal and it turned out to not be any good. Now, that didn't happen, or at least it looks like the Rouhani government is just going to step aside. That Raisi is going to either enter a deal or not enter a deal. It's going to be his administration that does it. I don't know why that is. I suspect that once Rouhani realized that he was gonna get all the blame for a bad deal and none of the credit for a good one, that probably didn't seem like too appetizing a circumstance in which to go finish up the negotiations. But it's also possible that Rice had just decided that or the supreme leader decided that this was something that they didn't want to leave to the outgoing administration in Iran, and that they were going to just kind of deal with it as the new one came in. But it sure looks like that Raisi is calling all the shots now in terms of what's going to happen going forward, and that the Rouhani
Yeah,
government is basically already out of power.
yeah, yeah. So again, we'll be back to this before too long, I'm sure, on the next episode because it is I, probably the number one big ticket item that's floating around out there, and there's so much uncertainty around the outcome now. Uh, I just was talking to someone in the government, a former colleague, who was like, "Yeah, we'll see what's happening. We're kind of all just waiting to see what's going to happen with Iran because it's going to have huge consequences." And I think that's what we're doing too. But in any event, we'll put that down for the moment. That brings us to the end
Well, it
of
has
our
huge
our
consequences for our practice as well. I mean, the thing is that
right,
right now, there's no business being done because everybody's waiting for a deal before
right,
the business begins. I mean, except in China, but
right,
and they're not asking for compliance advice before they are
right,
taking those oil shipments, because I think they know what the answer would be. And on the other hand, there's really not a lot of enforcement going on except in kind of some
right,
of the most egregious cases. So
right.
like the attempt to kidnap the Iranian journalist from the
Right.
U.S. I mean,
Which is
obviously,
another sort of, it's a little bit of gasoline on the fire here, which is like, are we really going to sit down and do a deal with a country that's going to attempt to do something on our home soil like that, which
right.
is never optically, again, that's just more, just makes things messier and just more complicated to justify doing something. So in any event, we'll circle back to this probably next time, if not, a month from now or so, once perhaps there's more movement. But just needed to do our check in on JCPO
Stay
2.0.
tuned.
Stay tuned as always. So with that, that's the end of our main portion of the show, and then I will pause for the lightning round sound effect. Only one topic on the lightning round docket for today, which is enforcement. So last time we talked a lot with Richard and Nate about what CBP is doing inbound in terms of customs and import enforcement, especially as it relates to human rights and these withhold release orders that are just having a huge impact on a number of importers in the U.S. And so we thought it would be useful, because we are basically 6 months in now to the Biden administration, to just do a very quick couple thoughts off the top of our heads, anecdotally, based on what we're seeing, both from our own practices and what we're reading, on whether or not we've noticed any sort of change in approach with respect to enforcement on the export and sanctions side of things. And this was also prompted in part because there were 3 OFAC settlements last week. There was a sentencing in a DOJ export controls matter. There was a plea in a criminal sanctions proceeding last week. So there was a fair amount of action last week. I've also heard through the grapevine that DDTC may be coming out soon with another consent agreement. We had Honeywell obviously earlier this year. This would be the second one this year, if there is another one that is going to come out at some point in the next couple of weeks. So I think that begs the question: Do we think there's anything different right now, as opposed to the way the Trump administration was doing its business on the enforcement side of things? And so let me kick it to Tim to offer his thoughts there, and then I'll weigh in quickly with mine.
So on Iran, I really think there's been very little change. I think that the probably correct view of enforcement was that on the secondary sanctions, as long as the JCPOA is being negotiated, it's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of enforcement of the secondary sanctions if they're just about to get lifted. And kind of that's what we've seen. And now there's a little bit of question as to whether or not the U.S. will alter that a little bit, but that's been so. I think the Biden administration has been different on the secondary sanctions in Iran. On the primary sanctions in Iran, they've been, I think, exactly the same kind of career government officials who've been enforcing the primary sanctions against Iran, the U.S. nexus sanctions there, particularly on the criminal side and at OFAC. There really doesn't seem to have been a lot of change. I mean, I think that's still an enforcement priority from the sanctions perspective. Same with North Korea, no real change in enforcement that I've seen. I think, the North Korean sanctions is an enforcement priority, and that gets relatively bigger. I think, to me, probably the biggest change that I've seen has been with respect to the Commerce Department. I thought that the Commerce Department enforcement, particularly when it came to China, was extremely politicized in the Trump administration, and I think you could see that because essentially every time they would put somebody on the entity list, Wilbur Ross would give a press release that credited the president for for flying and doing somersaults and winning the Olympic gymnastics championship or whatever. And so I think that there really has been a lot less, politicization in BIS in terms of enforcement, particularly when it comes to China. If I had to pick one issue, I think that would be it. And I think it's much more of a multi-agency approach when it comes to China, and a lot more targeted than it was in the Trump administration.
Yeah, I'll say the only thing I'll really say is this: as we have talked about at length, the prior administration was very focused on, as Tim said earlier in this episode, making it known that we were unhappy with and certain actors or countries, and so as a result, we were gonna put them on the SDN list, we were gonna put them on the entity list, and we were gonna do that as much as possible. And obviously, Iran and China primarily were the two areas where that was happening under the Trump administration. And in terms of the resources, the time, the energy, the effort, the staff support that is needed, whether it's at OFAC or at BIS or within the ERC when it comes to entity listings, to do that, to vet those cases, again, we've had some evidence that perhaps they weren't always being vetted as sort of thoroughly as they could have or have been historically, but nevertheless, there is obviously a cost and a time associated with that there was so much effort and so much time being spent on that perhaps it was a fair assumption that some time spent on just traditional kind of churning through investigations, reviewing the results of administrative subpoenas and working with parties to resolve matters was perhaps affected, was slowed somewhat. And now that doesn't really apply to DOJ, because I think DOJ kind of churns, especially in this space, kind of churns along at a normal pace. And that's probably one of the least politicized little pockets in the national security realm at DOJ, I would say. And so to some degree, there's the natural churn, and there's always the time lapse and the time needed to do these cases, to investigate these cases. As we always see, even with the cases that were resolved last week, this is old conduct. This is almost always very old conduct that we see. It's 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. There's tolling agreements. It takes a long time, whether it's voluntary disclosures on the administrative side, or it's or even on the criminal side, or it's just the investigations in the normal course, these are not quick investigations. These are not 6 months from the time of the conduct till resolution. That's just not what happens. It takes a while. And so I do think, and we've said this before, and I've seen this certainly firsthand when I was in the government, and now I see it with the investigations that I'm in charge of, that I'm interacting with the government on behalf of our clients, there's some randomness there in terms of how fast things move, what gets put to the top of the pile, what ends up getting prioritized, whether there is going to be the people power behind something to just push things through. So I don't know that there's enough data yet to say that there's really any change. In fact, I would probably say there's probably not much change, other than to say that my sense is that there is less time being spent on all of the things that I mentioned earlier. And to Tim's point, that things are less politicized now, that there's a bit more of a even keeled approach to these things. So it's just everybody kind of working through them in the natural course, going through the natural paces of an investigation, which are going to take a year, 2 years, 3 years, sometimes more, in any event. And so seeing how things break in terms of when charges are brought, when settlements are reached, when pleas happen, again, it's somewhat arbitrary. So looking at the yearly stats for OFAC settlements is sort of an arbitrary exercise sometimes, because if there's one big bank settlement in a given year, then that's going to juice the numbers. And if there are no big bank settlements in a given year, then guess what? They're going to look like it fell off big time. And that's just a kind of randomness of the calendar and the way things work. So my 2 cents right now, maybe minor changes, maybe a bit more business as usual in terms of working through investigations and working through enforcement matters across the board at the agencies. But I haven't seen anything thus far to really tell me or suggest that there is, big changes that have taken hold in the 6 months that the Biden administration's been in.
Yeah, I just think it's back to normal. I think basically, and I think it was most acute at BIS, but I was hearing from OFAC during the last administration, or from people who were at OFAC during the last administration, that decisions were being made at the upper levels of the Treasury and at the White House on OFAC matters that is pretty unusual. I mean, OFAC is it's not a political appointment
Right.
to be the director of OFAC. Now, when enforcement actions come out, there's a press release that comes from the director of OFAC. During the Trump administration, they almost always came from Mnuchin, and sometimes even a level above that. And I
Right.
think that the power has kind of migrated back down to the people who are normally doing enforcement. And I think, to your point, Brian, I think it's a great one. When the politicals get involved like they did, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with the politicals get involved. I mean, they got elected by the people, or at least the president did, and so the idea that the president gets to make decisions about his or her administration, that's democracy. So it's not a problem, but it does divert resources in a way that basically that at least in normal times they're not diverted in that way, and so it slows a lot of other things that are not the president's priority down, in a way that's not normal. And I think now that the politicals seem to be largely out of the OFAC and BIS enforcement realm, they're making decisions based on what much more predictable, I say normal, but kind of at least pre-2016 considerations. And so you can kind of predict how quickly they'll go and predict kind of what the result will be in a much easier way.
Yeah, I think to a person, the kind of watchword or the thing that we are hearing, and I've heard this both in having actual kind of official communications on certain matters and investigations, and also just talking to friends and former colleagues kind of across the government, is the normalization. Like Tim said, that is a good word for it, is that there has been a bit of a attacking back to the career level people sort of running things in an appropriate way, not
Right.
not in a deep state is out to subvert democracy sort of way, but in a, this is why we have the structure we have, so that you have the people at kind of the worker bee level that are doing these things and making judgment calls and getting them approved up the chain as necessary. But it is not so top down driven. And I think the top down actions that were taken kind of across the board over the last administration were drastically affecting kind of the pace of things and just sort of continuity, and why we did see some kind of sharp departures in certain types of activities in the enforcement space in this realm in particular. And there were so many consequential policy decisions that were rolled out in the course of the 2017 to early 2021 timeframe that did kind of upend things in a number of ways that I think it was almost inescapable that there was going to be some flow down that the sort of normal churn of enforcement matters perhaps was going to be, if not disrupted, at least impacted to some degree, timing wise and otherwise. So anyway, I think that's where we are on this at this point. I think no big news there, but just sort of thought it would be just kind of a useful check-in, because as opposed to what we heard from Richard and Nate the last time, where there has been a noticeable spike in CBP enforcement for a very clear reason on the WRO front, with respect to the human rights considerations coming out of Xinjiang and other places. We haven't really seen anything comparable to that, I think, in our space as of yet.
The one final word I will say on that is, I think, noticeably different is Venezuela. Like Venezuela was front and center for the Trump administration in enforcement, and it's at least at small sample size, so it's only been 6 months, but it does not appear to be front and center from an enforcement perspective. And in fact, at least from reading the signals, the administration appears really keen to kind of cut a quiet deal that allows for an election in Venezuela, but not to do it by essentially, imposing sanctions every couple of days against somebody, in Venezuela.
The non maximum pressure approach to free and fair elections. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I think that's right. But we'll time will tell with that. So in any event, let's leave enforcement behind for the time being. I think that's our show for today. I think we will likely be back in 2 weeks, if not 3 weeks, for one episode in August, and then I think we probably won't hear from us again until September, as Tim and I will both be in parts unknown, trying to with good internet, hopefully, but without our recording equipment in front of us. So that's I think likely for us. But in the meantime, hope that everybody out there is. We are recording this July 26th, so hope everybody is getting a little bit of a break. Hope everybody's being safe. Hope everybody's watching the numbers out there. There's no shame in wearing a mask, and being smart about what you're doing with your socializing these days. So to everybody, hopefully stay well, stay safe, and stay sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, stay COVID free, get your shots.